This is Craig with Carshalton Advisory. In this video, we're going to prepare you for writing the Excel 2016 core exam by walking you through the practice tasks for Objective 4.1, Summarize data by using functions. Let's get started. With our 4.1 workbook open, we're going to get started by working on a multiplication table. And I think this is actually where Excel in this course starts to get fun, because we're actually using it now to calculate some new values. And I'm going to go through this particular practice task in a fair amount of detail. I'm going to assume that most of you watching it are fairly fresh to Excel, and I'll go through some of the motivations and the process that gets us to the answer that's in the textbook. Detail that I think the textbook doesn't spend a whole lot of time going over. So with this multiplication table, what we want to do is calculate the product of the values in row 1 multiplied by the values in column A. So to do that, we're going to use a formula. And so in my formula, I'm going to hit equals. I'm going to go left and right like coordinate geometry. So I'm going to go left to right. I want to see what B1. I'm going to type a space, an asterisk, another space, and I'm going to left arrow over to cell A2. And when I hit enter, we're going to see that my result is 4. Okay, so you probably could have told me that. You didn't need Excel to calculate that value for you. One thing I will point out, I always like to have spaces on either sides of my operators. It does make your formula a lot easier to read. On a simple formula like this, it's not a big deal, but as your formulas get more complicated and complex, having those spaces in there will really help you parse out what's happening. So get in a good habit right now, and then later on you won't have to worry about it anymore. So we have our first value now calculated. But with that, only that value calculated, it doesn't tell us a whole lot. So, let's try that fill that we've done before in Excel. I really don't want to have to go into my next cell, type equals, up arrow, space, asterisk, space, and then over to my 2. That tells me that it's 6. Again, that's the right answer, but this seems pretty tedious. So let's see if we can figure out an easier way to solve this. One way I can solve this is by using what are called absolute formula references. So let's watch what happens. So we've done a fill before in Excel. Watch what happens when I select this arrow box and drag over to the right. Well, my 6 is still okay, but all of a sudden, what this should tell me is what 4 times 2 is. But yet I have the value of 16, and I know that 4 times 2 is not 16. So let's take a look at what happened. I can look in the formula bar and see what is going on. If I click in it, it actually highlights what cells are being involved. So it's telling me that it's taking 4, which is highlighted in blue and matches what's in the formula bar, and it's multiplying it times B2. Well, there's my mistake. I don't want it to multiply B2. What I want it to do is to multiply A2. Now, if it was just this one, I could just drag this red box over to the cell that I want. We're back to 8, and I have the result that I want. However, it hasn't fixed all of these other issues here. They're still not right. Now, these dollars or these pound signs that you're seeing here, that doesn't mean it's broken. All it's doing is letting me know that there are more digits than what will fit inside a cell that size. So if I was to make the cell wider, those would go away and we'd see a number. So let's take a look at these formulas and see if I can figure out a bit of a trick to make this easier so I understand what's going on. So I look at this one. It's B2 times A2. Yeah, that's right. Here, I've corrected this one, so it's C1 times A2. Okay, well, I noticed one thing right away that's the same. And if I go to the next formula, I'm going to hit F2 to display. Oh, again, that's going to A2. So obviously, as I move to the right, I want to always be referring back to cell A2. And Excel gives us a handy way of doing that, and that's by using an absolute reference. So if I go into my first cell here, this B2, and I click in my formula bar, I'm going to select this A2 so my cursor's touching it, either just beside it or in the middle of it. And I'm going to use an absolute reference. And to do that, I'm going to hit the F4 key. When I do that, you're going to notice that there's now a $sign in front of the A and a $sign in front of the 2. And what's happening here is Excel is telling me that it is going to lock that reference. So now, I'm going to do that again here. So now when I drag this to the right, let's do that and see what happens. Hey, perfect. I have the answer that I want. 4 times 2 is 8, 5 times 2 is 10, all the way up to 20 times 2 is 40. Perfect, I've got the right answer. So when I look at these formulas, I can see that, okay, it's taking the one above times the column 1. Here, same thing, it's kept that pattern for me. So that's using a structured, or excuse me, a absolute reference in my formula. So now let's try something else. I need to fill out this whole grid. So I'm going to take this now and I'm going to drag it down. Okay, I have a similar problem. The first one is okay, but now my second one is not right. I know that 2 times 3 is not 8. I should be having a 6 there. So I'll hit F2, and now I see what's happened, okay? So just like before, as I've drugged down, it was just referencing relatively to the cell that was directly above where my formula's at. And that's what it did when we were dragging horizontally. Same thing now is happening vertically. So let's see what we can do to figure that out. All right, so I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to go into this B1 now. I'm going to hit my F4 key to give me an absolute reference. Now let's see what happens. Hold on, that's not what you were expecting, was it? Let's take a look at what's happening. B1 times A2, B1 times A2, B1 times A2. Okay, so what's happened here is Excel has locked and made our references absolute to cell B2 and, B1 and A2 every single time, so this doesn't change. So what I want it to do is I want it to always stay with the one that's in to the left, or that's in column A, and also in row 1. So what I need to do is this blue one, we can change this absolute reference. I don't always want this one to be in column B, and I don't want this one to always be in row 2. So what I can do, let's start with this. I'm going to remove that $sign in front of the 2. And so now what will happen is Excel is always going to use column A, but the row is going to change as I shift the formula. So let's take a look at this. Let's drag it down and see what we got. Oh, perfect. 2, so 4, 6, 8, going up by 2 every single time. That's the answer that we want. So now that I know this is right, the first thing I want to do is to drag this all the way to the end. But again, this hasn't given me the solution that I want. This has given me partially right for the first column, but then every other column after that is different. So I'm going to hit undo, and then we'll take a look at what's happened here. So if I take this and drag it to the right, it isn't using a relative reference on the top row. So let's correct that. I'm going to go start at the beginning here, just so I know that everything will work properly. So this time, as I go to the right, I want the column to be fixed, but I want the row to be different. Or excuse me, I want it the opposite. So before we were locking the A for the vertical reference, this time we want to lock the row. So now let me fill this down. I'm just going to double click, and it's now filled that new formula all the way down. That hasn't changed. Let's drag it all the way to the right and see if it works for us. Let's see, 20 times 20 is 400. I'm going to hit F2. And sure enough, it is locked onto the top row, and the other aspect of my formula is locked into the first column. So anything I check in between here is going to follow that same pattern. So when we look in the formula bar, what we've done is we've used an absolute reference for row 1 for these values, but as it moves left to right, it's going to shift columns with us. On the other hand, the other factor, we're going to stay locked in row A, the first column, column A. However, as we go up and down, our row is going to be fluid. and change with this. So now we have correctly completed this table. Now, one more thing I want to do with you while we're together, and this again is a bit of best practices. When you take a look at this, and when you look at the finished product in the Excel workbook, you can't tell right away which is a formula and which has been entered in directly. So you should always get in the habit, or at least I always recommend, that you always indicate which is a calculation and which is an input. Now, Excel has given us some styles that are already set up with calculation and input. I'm going to warn you they're ugly, so I don't actually use their particular styles. I adjust them from my own work, but the concept is the same. So when I go in the Home tab, into my styles, you'll notice that one of them says input and one of them says calculation. Again, I warned you these aren't very good looking, so I recommend if you change them to make them look a little bit more appealing. But let me give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So I don't know which is a calculation and which is a hard-coded value. So now what I want to do is indicate, I'm going to highlight these cells, which are calculations. I'm going to go into my style selector, and I'm going to select calculation. All right, so this is ugly, but at least I know right away that these are the products of a formula, and it's not something that gets typed in. Now, the next is you have to make a judgment call whether you consider these constants, which don't change, or whether you want to encourage people to enter their own values. So when I leave a cell just in its normal format like this, black with no special markings, typically means it's a constant, and that I would expect the user to leave them as is. I might even lock the cells down if I was really concerned about it. Now, if I wanted a user to be able to change them, I would indicate it by using an input style. Now, again, the styles I use are not the same as what the defaults are, because this is, again, a little bit garish, and it would be hard to look at spreadsheets that were this bright day in and day out. But now that it's marked as an input, it might mean to me, or as my users, that, okay, if they want to see what a 12 looks like in here, they can type it in there, and that I don't want them typing into the sections at the bottom. So I'm going to do that and leave it indicated as a constant. And while the final sheet that the workbook has provided isn't going to look like this, when you check the formulas, they're going to be the same. So I'll just quickly review. Again, when we can press F2 to take a look at the highlighted cells in our formula, we want to highlight, or in this case, we want to make the row an absolute reference. On the other hand, we want to make the column an absolute reference. If I was to do this again, what I can do is use my F4 key. And when I toggle through my F4, it starts off by making both of them absolute. If I toggle it a second time, it makes just the row. A third time is just the column as an absolute reference. And fourth, it takes it back to a purely relative formula. All right, so this one is a little bit involved. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions about what we went through, don't hesitate to leave a comment. As always, your subscriptions, your likes, your shares are very flattering to me. Keep them coming. Thanks so much for watching. This is Craig with Carshalton Advisory.